Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. Nobody in my agency or any other agency of the federal government has reviewed or approved anything I'm about to say. And the main reason is, even I don't know what I'm about to say. Today I'm going to talk about a number of different subjects, and there's a lot going on in the world. The war in Kosovo is still going strong. We're bombing. The Serbs are implying that if we stop bombing, they might be willing to deal. I don't have the article in front of me, but that's been true for the last couple days and the last couple weeks. I've talked in detail about the bombing of the Chinese embassy and how that screwed up the diplomacy track, but the diplomacy track is slowly but surely getting back on track. Why? The Russians are back on board. The Russians are saying that they're willing to come in and mediate for us. Of course, they want to roll in Europe, and they want to roll in the resolution of the situation. And they don't want the Serbs to get bombed anymore because they're Russian Orthodox, and the Serbs are Serbian Orthodox, a very, very similar religion, just about the same. So that's all going on. We bombed another group of civilians, scores of civilians all over the place. That made the front page on a day when we flew 300 sorties and blew out bridges and power stations and so on and so forth. Is that changing the situation? Not necessarily. Meanwhile, the British are calling for ground troops. And Clinton, our president, is saying, I won't rule out ground troops, whereas previously ground troops were virtually ruled out. Is he changing his position? Is he about to put in ground troops? Is it a bluff? I hope it is, because ground troops could be a disaster for the United States and for Europe. Why? Because the terrain favors the enemy. It's mountainous. It's covered with trees. There's 900,000 Kosovar Albanian civilians going from place to place, and they're able to hide from the Serbs in the underbrush and the foliage. You can imagine what 40,000, 50,000, 100,000 Serb guerrillas would be able to do in the same situation. During World War II, the Serbs basically took on the role of partisans. They were occupied technically by the Germans. Over 500,000 troops were occupied for years by Serb partisans up in the mountains. Germans were not able to stop them, despite genociding Serbs, killing literally hundreds of thousands of Serbs. They were never able to get those Serbian troops out of the mountains and stop ambushes and attacks and so on and so forth from the Serbs. Would we be able to do much better? Well, that area is now really Albanian, but there's a lot of Serbs who've lived there throughout their whole lives. 200,000 live there now. A lot of Serbs had moved away during the 70s and 80s while the Albanians had autonomy, and there's a lot of Serbs that know the territory and know the mountains, know those particular areas, and are able to fight from them. So it could be a very, very bloody business. What's the best thing? Continue to bomb. How many casualties have we had from bombing? Basically, in the entire war, we've had 3 captured, all of which have been returned to us thanks to Jesse Jackson, and 2 killed. Were those 2 killed in battle? Absolutely not. They were killed in a helicopter accident, an Apache accident in Albania. They were not killed in battle. Meanwhile, we've been flying anywhere from 50 to 600 sorties every single night for 50 nights in a row. We've destroyed fuel supplies, military supplies, ammunition dumps, military vehicles, barracks, buildings, television stations. We're slowly, step by step, destroying the electric grid in the entire nation of Serbia. In a month or two, they'll probably be unable to run regular power over a long period of time. Slowly but surely, that country is not a modern country. It is being returned to its roots as a medieval country. Does that mean that the troops on the ground can't fight a guerrilla campaign? No, they don't need anything. They don't need civilization to run a guerrilla campaign. Does that mean that Milosevic is slowly but surely losing everything? Yes, that does mean that. And does that mean that his worst enemy, the Croatian nation, which has an army of 400,000 people that could be poised on the border at any minute, 100 miles from Belgrade and just a few miles from the second largest city, Novi Sad, yes, he's still there. They're right there, and they could jump into this conflict the minute that Milosevic and his army are virtually defenseless. And these are things that he has to think about. And this is a war that we can conduct with really not very much against us, except for a few things. There is some opposition growing on both sides of the spectrum throughout Europe. England has been pushing us to put in ground troops, and they've been frustrated that more hasn't been done. The German Green Party has already indicated that they want a bombing pause. The Italians are getting skittish and may want a bombing pause. Meanwhile, there's all kinds of diplomacy. Some of our diplomats have been meeting with the president of Finland, who's offered his offices as a potential mediator between the Serbs. The Finns are very, very close to the Russians and may intervene diplomatically. They're talking about a bombing pause after the UN Security Council goes ahead and condemns what the Serbs have been doing and basically supports the five demands, with the exception it would be an international force or a UN force instead of a purely NATO force enforcing the peace. If that occurs, they're talking about a bombing pause. Will that happen? I don't know. Clinton seems to be very, very forcefully right in the middle of nowhere, and he's basically continuing to bomb. Why is he able to bomb? Because right now the opinion on the war is 50-50, is not completely against him or not completely for him, and his own approval ratings are in the high 50s, not as high as during the impeachment, but still very, very high for a president in this particular period. What could hurt Clinton? What could hurt Clinton the most is what happened a few days ago, and that was a statistic that came out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that the inflation rate had gone to 0.7% in 1 month. It was a jump of 0.7% in 1 month. 0.7% in the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, represents almost a 9% inflation rate per year. It's in the eights. Very, very high historically, the highest inflation jump in 1 month for 8 years. Why is that so serious? Well, in some ways it's very serious, in some ways it's not. It's not so serious in the sense that more than half of this inflation jump, 0.4 out of the 0.7%, of course this is a month, you get the information a month after the thing has occurred, is all energy prices. And gasoline alone had increased 15% on average in a month. I've talked about this. Basically in the West Coast, the price of gas jumped from 95 cents to $1.50 and is just now starting to come back down. That's in California. Right here in Arizona, it jumped from the low 90s, 92, 95 cents, jumped all the way to $1.39, and now is down $1.27. And I've seen regular gasoline as low as $1.19. And I'm talking about regular unleaded at the cheapest place that you can find in the area. So basically the price has been going down. In Denver, I was in Denver about a month ago, it was already down to $1.09 in Denver. In the East Coast, it barely moved at all, from $1.33 to $1.35. In New York, I checked with some friends of mine, and New York just has high gas prices anyway, but it didn't increase. So the net throughout the country was a 15% increase, and that reflected to 0.4 for just that 1 month. Is that going to happen again? No, actually, in the following month, you're going to see a negative on that. But that did risk inflation fears, which brought down the stock market about 300 points, not that much, but some stocks got hit pretty hard. I know because I have some. And there's fears that the Fed, the Federal Reserve Board, was going to raise interest rates. Fortunately, Greenspan got there. They had the monthly meeting, and they decided not to raise rates, but they decided to lean toward worrying about inflation as opposed to leaning toward trying to keep this boom going. And that has affected the markets, even just that decision, just to think about inflation as opposed to expansion. And that's may stall the stock market. The stock market might start going backwards a little bit, or just stay in the upper nines and lower tens, or 10,000s for the Dow. Now, the Dow actually is not a very good judge of the stock market nowadays. Best thing to look at is Standard & Poor, which went up to almost 1400s now in the low 1300s, or the NASDAQ, which had topped out almost at 2700 and is now around the 24s and 25s. So there has been some retrenchment. It's not terrible, it's not great, but the constant expansion in the stock market that was fueling our economic expansion, the best thing in the world for Bill Clinton, got him through the impeachment, got him through the first stages of this war, may not be the case anymore. We'll see whether inflation comes back. If the inflation picture looks bad the following month, the Federal Reserve will probably raise interest rates, and if they do raise interest rates, then you're probably going to see a real correction in the stock market. People won't feel as rich, they won't spend as much, and that could spark a long overdue, actually, recession, which hasn't occurred. Now, the irony of the whole thing, if you watch my show last year and the year before, I was very, very concerned about literally an economic collapse in the Asian economy. What do I mean by the Asian economy? Total stagnation in Japan, a near collapse, 1929 style Great Depression collapse in Malaysia, Indonesia, which has since had riots, and now their government was overthrown, replaced with, oddly enough, a democratic government. Thailand, the Philippines, and South Korea. The situation in South Korea was so bad that if the IMF bailout had been 2 weeks later, there would have been no hard currency in that country at all. They would have been unable to import anything or to export anything. That would have caused a complete collapse of the 12th largest economy in the entire world. As it was, South Korea contracted a lot. It was a real disaster. There was a lot of trouble, and they've since managed to get through with it. Even though the Japanese economy won't gain very much, the South Korean economy is going to gain 4 or 5%. The Chinese economy is gaining. The Hong Kong economy, and I believe the Malaysian economy is going to gain about 7% growth. And that's pretty good. So as these Asian economies come back, we may have a situation where while the American economy was expanding at the greatest rate throughout the 90s in American history, the European economy was in recession, the Asian economy was in near collapse, the Mexican economy had to be bailed out in 1994 with an almost collapse in the Mexican peso where we bailed them out. There was a collapse in Brazil about 6-8 months ago where their economy almost lost all of its reserve currencies, and it came to a very, very near collapse that affected a lot of other things. Our stock market went down 20% as a result of it. There are a lot of troubles in the world economy that we've been virtually immune to. So oddly enough, as these economies come back, we may be coming into a situation where we're starting to get some inflation, and as a result, we're reducing our money supply, increasing our interest rates, and our stock market might go down, and we may go into a recession, in which case we won't be able to buy up all of those extra goods that are being produced by these economies that are just coming back online. And that is a very great possibility. So it's ironic that this could happen. But so far, so good. Another one of the things that's roiling the markets and could hurt Clinton a lot is that the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Rubin, one of the greatest Treasury secretaries in history, the guy, in my opinion, who kept Mexico from collapsing into revolution when he saved the peso. The Congress at the time, this was in 1994, would not vote a bailout package for the Mexican peso, in which, during the period of which the Mexican middle class literally lost 50% of their buying power in the space of a couple weeks. Almost a complete collapse of a neighboring country while there was a revolution going on in the southernmost province or state of Chiapas. And that they were training guerrillas throughout the rest of the country. So Mexico could have collapsed into a Mexican Revolution type situation. And that didn't happen because Rubin, probably against the Constitution, found other sources of government money, $20 billion, to bail out the peso against the wishes of the Republicans in Congress. An amazing situation. How was he able to appropriate money even though Congress didn't appropriate it? And if anybody reads the Constitution, you can see that the House of Representatives controls the purse strings of this nation according to our constitutional government. Well, he found it through the World Bank, the Export-Import Bank, and a whole bunch of other semi-private, semi-public, semi-government, government-funded, but semi-private organizations that came up with the $20 billion and bailed out Mexico. That situation didn't quite happen when the Asians started to collapse, because the IMF, the government, and even the situation was so serious, even the Republican Congress realized that everybody had to do something to prevent a 1929 style worldwide meltdown. And we were very, very close to that about 2 years ago. And then last year we had the hedge fund collapse. And that was an organization, a private, basically a hedge fund, one of these mutual fund type situations that only handled really big money and played games with currencies, basically. Collapsed, and the Federal Reserve came in and bailed them out. But even so, our stock market went down over 10%, about 15%. The NASDAQ went down 20%, and we were on the edge of a real serious situation that if the Fed hadn't done the right thing, Rubin hadn't done the right thing, the market could have lost confidence, and we could have had one of those collapses that would create a situation throughout the world. At exactly that time, the Brazilian economy was collapsing while this hedge fund collapsed. So just last September, I believe it was August or September, we had a very similar situation. So we have had situations that if we didn't have the institutions that we have today helping and controlling the economy and keeping the money supply going and keeping confidence that people can borrow and that people can get money, we've had a number of instances since the '87 stock market collapse, a loss of 22% in one day, all the way through the Asian collapse when the South Korea virtually was out of international funds and would have been unable to trade, to buy food or anything 2 weeks from that situation, to the collapse of the Mexican peso and to the collapse of the long-term hedge fund. We've had a number of circumstances which are very, very similar to what happened on Black October in 1929, that because they didn't do the right thing, they called in loans, they made things non-liquid instead of more liquid, basically created collapses of banks throughout the country, throughout the world, and eventually created a Great Depression, which occurred throughout the entire industrialized world, throughout all of Europe, Japan, the United States, Latin America, and lasted for a decade, and was only rescued through World War. I mean, the fact that people got jobs and had to make weapons to fight a world war was the only thing that brought the world out of the Great Depression, and that was a very scary thing. And right now we have a lot of institutions to prevent that, and they've worked because we've had 3 or 4 different panics that have been nipped in the bud by Greenspan, by Rubin, the Secretary of the Treasury, who just resigned, and by the IMF, the World Bank, and all these other institutions which are there to say, yes, the world has reserve currency, the world has liquidity, people are going to be able to borrow money. Don't call in all your loans every time there is a panic, and has kept the economy under control while entire nations have basically collapsed into depression. And that's been occurring on and off and getting worse since 1994. Mexico was the first, and then Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea, the Philippines, Hong Kong, a number of Asian countries, and the most recent one to come to the edge of collapse is just now coming back. Well, Russia collapsed a long time ago, and so many times I can't even count it. But Brazil, which is a pretty big player, 9th or 10th largest economy in the world, virtually collapsed just a few months ago. So the world is always in danger of coming to a situation where there's just no money anywhere, where nobody has any confidence in their own currency, nobody has any confidence in the world economic system, and nobody is willing to loan anybody else any money. People are taking money out of the banks, putting it into cash, out of stocks, out of bonds, and the result is a liquidity crisis throughout the world. And once that happens, it's very, very hard to recover from. It's very, very hard to convince people that there is money, because money, in effect, is really not a real thing. It's the fact that these pieces of paper or these little bytes in your computer, people have faith that those things are going to buy food, going to buy shelter, are going to pay mortgages, are going to be able to keep them alive. It's that faith. That's where the word credit comes from. Credit means I believe. Debit means I owe. These are Latin words. And somebody way back at the beginning of the economic system in the 1400s in Italy realized that what money is a representation. It's people's belief that there's some value in it. And that goes for even solid things like gold. Don't believe for a second that if you buy gold as a hedge against the collapse of the economy, that means anything, because the price and value of gold can collapse too and become worthless, or virtually worthless. During the Great Depression, the odd thing about the Great Depression, while people were starving en masse because they had no money to buy food, the price of food was collapsing, and farmers were throwing food away because they couldn't get a decent price to sell it enough to cover their mortgage and their loans. So it was a complete disaster in every way. And now we have international institutions that prevent this exact kind of disaster from happening. And it's come very, very close. Just 6 months ago, we had a perturbation when this hedge fund collapsed that could have caused a Great Depression. Same thing when the South Korean economy collapsed. Same thing when the Mexican economy collapsed in 1994. That was already creating so much tension and so much deprivation that guerrilla wars and people were going off to the mountains to fight the government. And that could have spread to the borders of the United States and didn't. So we've had some pretty good stewardship over the world economy, and now one of the stewards, not the only one, but one of the chief stewards Mr. Rubin, the Secretary of the Treasury, has resigned. He's been replaced by Summers. Summers was his right-hand man, present during all these crises to try to solve all these problems. We don't know whether he's going to be as good. My name is Reed Silverne. The name of the show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. Thank you.